Hi, my name is Carl Lang from Archangel Games, and today I'll be running through how to set up a scripted setup for a game in Tabletop Sim. So the game I have here is one of my prototypes, the Bathhouse, and I'll basically be running through how this mod is set up for how this setup button works here. I'll just give you a quick little rundown of what we actually have in the game. So I've got everything sitting on the table. Basically, as you'd pull it out of the box and divide everything into their separate stacks. Here we have the staff cards. We've got a deck of guest cards. We've got a number of baths, which is currently sitting on the two players space here. And we've got our deck of ingredient cards, which are various ingredients. The text that I've got showing here is actually just text using the text tool that I've written onto the table. I find this is a neat way. This was sort of my intermediate way before I scripted this to show where things go, just to make it a little bit easier for players. For me, the point of scripting something in Tabletop Sim is not to automate it, but to make it as easy for players as possible, as opposed to just automating things for any old reason. So you want to make it, for me, I want to try and make the game as realistic as possible and as easy for players to see what's happening and how, and to understand how the game would work in real life. So the last one we have here is the 2-player starting card. So for a game with only 2 players, we use this card, otherwise it gets discarded. So I'll just click the setup button here, and you can see the game load. So how we actually what we're doing here is the baths. There's a certain number of baths depending on the number of players, and then there's the game ends at a certain point once a certain number of manager cards are revealed from the guest deck. And I'll get to how that works in a sec. So we'll just click the setup button here. So we deal out the baths. We deal out guests into those baths. The staff cards got shuffled into the guest deck. That 2-player card just got placed over the back here, and everybody got dealt cards. So I'll just do that one more time so you can see again. You'll also notice now when we click load here that we get a nice little welcome message. Welcome to the Bathhouse. Click the setup button when all players are seated. So that stays up for about a couple of seconds, but you can also see it down here in the messages as well. So again, being a 3-player game, it's going to fill the baths up to here. The guests will get dealt into the baths. Managers get shuffled into the deck. The 2-player starting card gets removed. The ingredients are dealt out, and then each player gets dealt 3 cards from the remaining ingredient deck. Just like so. We have another message here saying game set up for 3 players. The game will end immediately when the 4th staff member is revealed from the deck. So how the game would actually work, these guests throughout the game will fill up here. We have managers shuffled into the deck here somewhere. Keep going until we get one here. There we go. So the idea is that you place these at the top, across the top here. We'll just assume these are managers as well. And what we have here, see when the 3rd one is placed, we get another pop-up saying the 3rd staff card is revealed. Game ends immediately when the next one is revealed. Now I haven't actually scripted that to actually end the game, but that's just a little flag just to help people remember that the game will end at that point. And how I've done that is with a scripting zone, as you can see, sitting across the bottom here. And I'll get into how all that works in a second. So I will just reload the game once more. So how we actually script in Tabletop Sim is up in the modding button up the top. You go to scripting. This gives you the scripting window. So this is where all the code for the setup actually lives. I find this is actually a little bit tricky to code in. It doesn't lay it out quite as nicely as I'd like. It doesn't color code it like some other programs do. So I actually use another program which I've got open to the side over here called Notepad++, which color codes everything. It lets you lay it out a lot easier. And then I basically write my code in there and then copy it into the scripting window to load it into Tabletop Sim. And I'll put a link to that in the description below. So you'll see everything here is in global. You can also script things on items. So for example, I could right click on here, go scripting, script editor, which will pop up the same script editor window, but you'll see that we're now in that piece as opposed to the global. So for setups, I tend to do everything in global. I'll show a couple of other little things that I've scripted on items themselves after I go through how the script works for this game. So I'll just drag this over here. So this is Notepad++. You can see it color codes things, which makes it a lot easier to read. So we have the green is all comment, so that's code that's not run, but just gives you, I guess, a little bit more of a description as to what's going on. Blue are keywords within the program. Numbers are all orange, and it just makes it a lot easier to read, basically. What I'll do here is I'll just step through what the code is doing, what all the different functions do, and how they work. This may be a little bit high level for people that don't have any programming experience, but I'll simplify it as much as I can. And hopefully, I'll put all this code up online as well. Hopefully, you'll be able to sort of step your way through it and work out what's going on. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to assist. So, the first thing we have at the top here is a function that I've created myself. So this is a function called getObject. So this is a custom function that I've written myself. And I'll actually jump back into this in a second. So this top function is one that I've created. The next one that we have here is called onLoad. So again, this is a function, runs from here down to the end. And you'll see, I should probably indent those. You'll see that basically how we write code, or what the easy way to follow what's going on is that you tab things across that are within each section. So here we have the function, which runs down to this end point here. So this function is called onLoad. OnLoad is actually a tabletop sim defined function, and this gets called once the game, once all the components in the game have loaded. So you'll see the first thing we have in there is this getObjects function, which is the one that I've written above. So basically, once the game loads, it then steps into this function, which will run all this code. And so basically we'll just step through here, run all these lines of code, and then that's the onLoad function complete. So what we have here, we call the getObjects, which is this function here. Now I always put this at the top of all my code for Tabletop Sim. Basically what this is doing is we're gathering up all the various components. So every item in Tabletop Sim has what's known as a GUID. This is a unique identifier for that part. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating a variable which is referring to the individual objects. So this first one, guests deck, I'm referring to the guests deck here. So what we do is we go guest deck, so that's, I can put whatever name I like there, equals, which is assigning the thing on the right to this variable. Then we have getObject from GUID. So this is another Tabletop Sim function. And what we have in here is the unique identifier for that deck. So to get that identifier, if I right click on the guest deck here, I can go down to scripting, and you'll see here we have a GUID shown, which is the ID that I've got there. So I can click that, it will copy it, go over here, and then paste that in here. The reason that I do this at the top separately is so that if I change the components in the game, add a different deck in, so if I'd updated these cards, deleted it and added a new one in, all I need to do is update this GUID here for the new deck, and the rest, I don't need to change anything else within my code. So what we're doing here is just going through collecting all the decks, so the guest deck, the staff deck, the baths deck, and then the ingredients deck. The two-player manager, which is this card sitting by itself, I gather that one separately because it's, I guess I'm doing something different to it, to the rest of the cards. We also have the setup button. So the setup button, if I rotate around here, you can actually see the setup button is attached to this checker, checker piece under here. So how the button works, and I'll get to this in a sec, but basically it's attached to an object. So I'll get to how that works in a second. So basically we have the setup button, which is the GUID for that checker under there, and then we also have the starve zone, which is how that end, we get that pop up at the end. So that's actually the GUID for this scripting zone here, and I'll show how that works when we get down further in the code. So onload is basically, so the first thing onload does is call this get objects, which then gathers all these objects up, so it's got them stored to be able to be manipulated. The next thing we do here is we check if the setup button exists. So if once you click the setup button, it deletes itself, you saw. So the first thing we do is we want to make sure that that button still exists. So we've got setup button, which is the button that we gathered up here. This symbol using the tilde equals is not equal. So if setup button is not equal to nil, which is a keyword within LUA, which is the language that this is all in, it checks if so if the button is not equal to nil, so if it does exist, then we run the code within here. And what we're basically doing here is creating our button on the checker piece. So the first thing we do is I go setup button equals interactable, setup button dot interactable equals false. So what this is doing is changing the interactable variable of this piece to be false. So what this means is you'll see you can't actually click or do anything with this button. So that's completely locked. Players cannot touch or interact with that, which means they can't delete it and wreck the setup, basically. So that's permanently locked there. I could, if I wanted to, lock all the other pieces as well using the same thing, as I've already gathered those. So I could have guest deck dot interactable equals false as well, which would mean that you wouldn't be able to click on those and then make them true again once the setup is complete. But yeah, for this I haven't. The next thing we do is we create the button. So how we do this, we do setup button, which again is referring to that checker piece, dot create button. So what this is another built-in function which has a number of parts that we put into it, which then is how the button looks and works. So the first thing we have here is label equals, and we have setup, which is the text on the button itself. So you'll see that's in quotation marks. So any text needs to be in quotation marks. If it's not, it will think it's a function that we're trying to call, or it'll get confused basically. The next thing we have is position. So this is the position of the button over the checker piece. So this is a x, y, z coordinate that we're passing in here. So x is your left and right, y is up and down, and z, up and down I mean as in up in space, and down, and z is this direction. So we set the button to be I've set the button here just to be 0.5 above the checker piece, so you can see it is actually hovering above the piece there. Next we have click function. So this is a function that is called when you click this button, which we have below here, and I'll get in, which basically runs the setup and tells all the cards where to go. Next we have function owner equals self, so that's saying that the button belongs to itself. We also have the width and the height. This is again of the button itself. The font color, this is an RGB value, so 000 is black, and the font size, I've just set the size there. So you can play around, tweak these, which will change the size of the background and the button color and text and all that, so you can change all those. I'll also put a link in the description below to the Tabletop Sim API, which is basically a big database or a big wiki that has what all these different things do, what the variables are, what the different things are that you can manipulate. So there's a lot more than just this in here. So you could also change the button color. You can change so when you hover over it, it has a different color to what it is as default. You can change all that stuff. So I'll put a link to the API in the description as well. So the next thing we have, and this is still within this onload function, which is all the code between the function onload and end, is the this broadcast to all, which are the messages that popped up at the start. just jumping back a little bit. So what we actually have here for this if statement, I'll just run through how this works. So we have if setup button is not equal to nil, then we run this code. Now, at the bottom of this if, we need to close this if off, which we close with an end. So you'll see there's another one down here. This one's closing off the end of the function. And this is why we tab things across to indent them, to make it easier to see where the ends need to be. So this function contains everything within here. The setup button is everything within here. And you can see that's just a lot easier to follow than if they were all in line. So back down to this broadcast. So what we have here is broadcast to all is another tabletop sim function, which sends that text up onto the screen, the welcome to the bathhouse, and click setup when all players are seated. So you'll see I've actually got these lines backwards. This is to do with how Tabletop Sim loads these lines. So it broadcasts this line, and then this line jumps above that. So you actually have to do these backwards if you want multiple lines so that they come up in the order that you want. So how this function works, broadcast to all, it takes a couple of variables. We have the actual text that we want. So that's the text that it will display on the screen. We then have the RGB value. So we've got red, green, and blue. So I've got 30 red of the 255, 135 of 255 green, and basically 100% blue, which is the color that we're telling it to display there. Same again for the second line. We do the same thing there. So that sets up our button and creates our button on the checker piece. So the next thing we have then is when you actually click this setup button, it's going to call this setup game function. So this is another function that I've had to write. It's another, so it's not a tabletop sim thing. So we have function game setup, which is the variable that will get called. The function that will get called when we click the button. So what we have in here is basically we're just stepping through exactly as you would to set up the game. So initially we have a number of variables that we're creating. So the first thing that we need to know when we go to set up the game is the number of players. We also need to then from the number of players we can determine the number of baths that need to be played out, and the number of staff that will trigger the end of the game. You'll see that the players' baths have the word local in front of them, so that's a local variable within this setup game function only, so they can't be interacted with outside of here. This is just good practice. It probably doesn't actually need it. It's not going to affect Tabletop Sim setting it up if they were global variables, but by having them local, basically what that means is they get destroyed once it leaves this function, which is just good programming practice. Num staff, which is the number of staff required for the game to end. This one doesn't have local written in front of it, so this is actually a global variable. So this is accessible by everything in here, and I have that as a global variable because the scripting zone is actually referencing this as well. So I'll get to that in a second when we finish going over the setup. The next two things we have here are two more variables called delay add and delay sum, and basically these are the delay from when we click the setup. I'll just click that again now so you can see there's a slight delay between each thing happening. And I'll get into why we need to do that in a second. So the first thing we want to do here is we need to count the seated players basically, which will then tell us how many people are playing the game. So what we do, we have local players list. So this is creating a local variable called player list, and that is we're assigning the variable, or assigning to it the result of get seated players. So this is a Tabletop Sim function, and what this does, this is returning a list of the colors of players in the that are currently seated at the table. So this in this particular setup will be returning a list with the words blue, green, and yellow, because that's the colors that are seated at this table. What we want to then do with that list is we want to basically count the number of things in there. So there's 3, blue, red, and green, blue, yellow, and green. How we do that is with a for loop. So what we have is for underscore. Now the underscore is a throwaway character, so if we wanted to actually have a number in here, we could choose to say how many times we're iterating through this for loop, but the underscore is basically a throwaway, so it's just going to iterate through everything in here until it gets to the end of the list. So we have for underscore in iPairs player list. So what this is doing is looking at the list, player list that we get that we created up here, and then we go do, and this is what we want it to do, is we're going players, which is currently equal to 0, equals players plus 1. So in this case, it's going to iterate through that 1, 2, 3 times. So players currently equals 0. So the first time, players equals 0, it then becomes equal to players plus 1. So 0 plus 1 is 2, 0 plus 1 is 1. We'll then iterate through that again. So it's currently equal to 1 here, equals 1 plus 1 is 2, and then it'll do it a third time. When it equals 2 plus 1 is 3. Once it reaches the end of that list, we then end this loop here. We drop out of that. The next thing we then do is we set the variables for the number of baths and the number of staff for the game. So what we're doing is basically looking at the value that players was. So if players equals 2, so if there's 2 players, then we want num baths, which is the number of baths, to equal 4, which is how many is required for a 2-player game, and number of staff to equal 4, which is how many is required to end a 2-player game. Else, if instead players is equal to 3, then we want the baths to equal 5 and staff to equal 4, and so on. So what we're doing here, basically we go if, then, and because we're still doing the same check so that it doesn't need to check each of those, we go else if. So if if the players was equal to 3, it would stop here and leave this this statement, which runs from the if down to the end. Yeah, we do these as an if else. You'll see then right at the very bottom of those, once we check for the different player counts, we also have another else. So this is like a catch-all. So if it didn't, if the players isn't equal to 2, 3, 4, or 5, what this will do is then broadcast a message onto the screen like before that says 2 to 5 players only, and it changes the color to red. So it basically sends a little warning message saying you can only play this game with 2 to 5 players. You'll notice at the end there, here, we then have a return. So what this return does, this is actually, this is quite important, the return here at the end, if, and this is only if this else is run, basically what this is doing is if this is the bit that runs, we then return out of, so it basically leaves this setup. So it returns from here back to just the rest of the game. So it leaves this part of code. If we don't put this in here, it will continue to run through the rest of the code. So this basically breaks the, stops it going any further in code from this point forward. So next we get to actually setting up the various cards. So I'll just reload this again here. Now this is where these delays come into it. So what Tabletop Sim does, how it actually works, when we click this button, it runs through this whole setup function in a fraction of a second. So to make it look more realistic, to have a little bit of delay in between each, and we actually and also to allow things to settle before the next thing happens, we use the wait function. So what this does is basically is how we're getting that pause between various things. What we do is we have wait.time. So this is calling the wait function, and the time part of the wait function, basically, which you can also do this based on frames, but I tend to do it based on time. So how this function works, basically all the code within it won't run until the delay has passed. So you'll notice each of the various sections, setting up the hot springs, setting up the guests, shuffling in the staff cards, are all done within these wait time, this wait time function. So it basically waits that amount of time from when you from after the button is pressed before it will do that, basically run the code inside there. So what we have is wait code, wait time, and then we have to start that with function bracket bracket. So this just creates like an empty function. Basically we just have this little mini function inside here, is what we're doing between here and here. So what we're doing to set up the baths, I'll just load it again within here, is firstly what we're doing, what I do here is I get the position of this deck, of where this deck is currently. So how we do that, I create another little variable called pos, or position, that equals baths deck, which is what we gathered right at the very top in the get objects. And then we go dot get position. So get position is another tabletop sim function that relates to that object, and that will get its current position in space. You can actually see this if you go to the gizmo tool, click move, and then click on the object, and you'll see the position there. So that it's currently at x 10.5, y 1.01, and z 0. So what we then do with that is we iterate through using a for loop to lay out the correct number of baths. So how I'm doing this is I'm going for I, this is just creating another little variable called I, that equals 1. Then for number of baths minus 1. So what we're doing is basically stepping through this for loop, the number of baths minus 1, and the reason we do minus 1 is because the bath is already sitting on the first spot where the first bath would go. So what this will do is we'll step through this function equal to the number of baths. So for a 3-player up here, number of baths equals 5. So we're going to step through this 4 times, which will put out 1, 2, 3, 4 baths. So what it does, we go pos, which is our position that we gathered here of where the deck is currently. We go that equals a vector. So what we're doing basically is we're modifying the vector of where this is. So we know where this deck is currently, and we want to place the new card at a position equal to that location plus a bit more, which is basically out here. So what we're doing is go pos vector. So this is creating a vector. So making pos equal to the vector pos.x minus 5, which is this direction, comma y and z. So the y and z stay exactly the same as what they already were, because we don't want to adjust that position, only along this way. We then go baths deck, which is this deck here, dot take object. This is a tabletop sim function which will take an object from a deck and then place it somewhere, and the position we want to place that to, we use, this is again, position is part of the take object function, so we want to set its position to this position here that we just created, which is 5 units across. So it sets 1 to there. It will then go through again, and it still has this location here, so it sets the next one at 5 across from that, and then it sets the next one at 5 across from that again. And so it'll step through and do that each time. So that's what's inside the wait function here. So that will that's this part of the code, and then it will wait until delay some time until it does it. So if we have a look up here, I've got 2 variables, one called delay add, which equals 0.5, which is half a second, and then delay sum, which currently equals delay add. So it currently equals that 0.05. What we do after I set up each thing is I make delay sum equal to delay sum plus delay add. So basically that's just adding another 0.5, another half a second to the sum each time, so that it will wait then another half a second before we do the next thing. So the next one we have is set up the guests, which is moving those guests into the hot tubs, into the baths. So we do that exactly the same as what we did above with the hot springs. but you'll notice this time we don't have to do the -1 because the guests don't actually start in the baths there. So we're doing this exactly the number of hot springs, not the -1. You'll see also in the take object, we do have an extra variable that we've assigned in here as well. So we've also got position equals pos, which is our pos that we set here with that 5 units across. We also want to go flip equals true. So what this does is it will flip the card to be face up as it's taken from the deck and put into its new position. So again, that will wait for the delay sum time before that runs, and then we add another 0.5 to delay sum. So the next thing we have, once the guests are dealt, is we are shuffling in the staff cards. So how we do that? Again, we're waiting, and what we want to do is go guests deck, which is this deck here, equal dot put object staff cards. So what that does is it puts the object staff cards, which is this deck here, into the guest deck. So we basically just moving that deck, the staff deck into the guest's deck. We then straight after that have to do another delay, add to the delay again, and then we can shuffle the deck. So we go guest deck dot shuffle, which will shuffle this deck. The reason we have to have a delay in between here is if you don't have this extra delay, it will actually shuffle the deck before the cards get in there, because it takes a second or so before the cards actually move from where they are into the deck. And so to shuffle the deck, we go get guest deck, which is the guest deck, which now contains the staff cards, dot shuffle. And then we add to the delay yet again. So the next thing we have here is the 2-player starting staff card. So what we're doing here is first we check, so again within a wait function, we check if players equals 2. So if players does equal 2, what we want to do is move the 2-player manager card. We want to set its position, so basically we're just moving the card to a new location. So what we do is go dot set position smooth, and smooth means that it moves smoothly as opposed to jumping straight there, so it looks a lot nicer to the end user. And we want to set its position to basically we've got snap points all along here, so we want to set that to the position that this is in currently. So to get that position, I've just used the Gizmod tool, click here, and that shows me the position. All I've done is literally just copy that to the clipboard and then pasted that in there. So that's so that I know that's going to be exactly where I want it to be. So we move the 2-player manager card position to that location. So what we're doing here is if it's not equal to 2, so if it's any other value other than 2, we move the card to behind the rulebook over here. So I do 2 things here. Basically, I'm rotating it before I set its position. So just because I ended up sitting it on the corner at a little bit of an angle. So first I set its rotation, which is rotating it slightly. Then I set its position to up the back here. And to do that, again, I just sort of sat the card in place. I'll just change my rotation there. I just sat the card in place to where I wanted it. And then I can use the Gizmo tool to copy the position and copy the rotation and then put them in there. Then we do another delay again. So the next one we have is setting up the ingredients deck. So same again, we're getting the position of the deck, we shuffle the deck, so ingredients deck dot shuffle, which will shuffle the cards. There's always 5 ingredients, so for I equals 1 to 5 do, so it'll always put 5 out. And same again, we're just moving them out X distance across from where the position of the deck currently is, which is our get position, and then push them across. Again, we want these to be face up, so we have flip equals true, which will place them face up. then we have our delay. So the last, or second last thing we have in here is then dealing the cards to players. This one's really easy. We just go ingredients deck.deal, which is referring to the deck itself. Deal is a tabletop sim function that will just deal cards to every seated player. So we just want to deal 3 to every seated player. And then and then we add to our delay again. So the very last thing we have down here, now this could be at the top as well potentially, because it's not in a wait time function, this will actually happen basically as soon as the button is clicked. But we go setup button.destroy. So what that does, if you recall, the setup button is the checker itself. So what that will do is actually destroy the checker button, which the checker piece which the button is attached to. So that will remove that, which means that the game can't be set up again once it is set up. Lastly, we do another broadcast to all, which is that message that pops up on the screen. And this is after the delay yet again, so as it's within the wait time function. And we broadcast, and again this has to be backwards to get the two lines to work properly. So game set up for players. So how we do this, we have game set up for is the first part of text. We use the dot. 2 dots is to join a variable into a string. So we go game set up for dot players, which is our variable that we calculated how many players were in the game. So in this case 3. Dot, and then it says the word players. So it will say game set up for 3 players, and it will say game ends immediately when, same again, dot number of staff, dot. So game will end immediately when 4th staff card is revealed from the guest deck. And that's our full setup to lay out all the cards in the game. So the next thing we have right at the very bottom here is our scripting zone. So if I show you the zone again here, so we've got our scripting zone here. Basically what this is doing, as those staff cards come out and get placed in here, when one less than the number is required, we get a little pop-up saying game will end in 1 turn. So how we're doing that, this is another tabletop sim built-in function called onObjectEnterScriptingZone. So what's actually happening here is we have our scripting zone on the table, and when an object such as the card enters that zone, so when it physically collides with this zone, this bit of code will get run. So what this code is actually doing, the very first thing we do is we check if the setup button equals nil. So we want to make sure that the game is set up before this bit of code runs. So we go if setup button equals nil, so if the button's gone, then we go local objects equals staff zone, which is that zone, dot get objects. This will get anything that's within this zone. So technically, if I was to put a cube in here, it will recognize it as a thing as well. So if I was to take that out and put the cube there, because I got it to collide with the zone, it will actually recognize that. You can make this more robust by like naming the cards to be manager, and then it specifically looks for that card type or that card description. I haven't bothered to go to that extent here, but that's something that you can play around with. So what we're doing is getting all the objects that are in that scripting zone, so it'll look for how many things are there. Then we make local count equal to 1. What we do, the reason we do this is because it actually starts at 0, and we're trying to count how many things are in there. So what we do, then we go for each object in this objects that we just gathered, do count equals count plus 1. So you'll see here we also have print. So if you look in the little comment here, you'll see it says 3 items in zone. So that's just a little line that's being printed. That's only visible to the host. The point of doing this is basically just for debugging, so I know that it's working properly. So this is actually why I had to do this count equals 1, because for whatever reason it was always 1 short of what I needed. We just started it at 1 to make it work properly. So what this is doing is then counting all the objects in the zone. So that's going to iterate through each of those objects within this object list, which is made up of all the different objects that are in there. Then we go if count, which is what we've just iterated through here, equals number of staff minus 1, because we want it to display the message when there's 1 staff less than what's required to end the game. We pop up the message, count staff cards revealed, which is the amount that we're at currently. Game will end immediately when next staff card is drawn, and pops that up on the screen to give players that reminder. And that's basically it. So that's how I've gone about setting up this game in Tabletop Sim, and scripting that setup. I will show you just a couple of extra little things here, so I'll just load this up one more time. Just some other neat little scripting things that I've created that I've found useful. I'm just going to maximize this here. So a couple little things that I've created myself with code linked to an object itself. So we'll go to saved objects here. Just put this bag down here, and I'm going to add another item, this bag here. So these are 2 bags that I've added code to myself to do different things. So as you're probably aware, in Tabletop Sim, bags do not shuffle when you drop things in them. This can be quite annoying, depending on what game you've got, what you're doing with the bag. So what I've done here is basically made a bag that will shuffle itself. So I'll show you the code in this for this bag, and this is actually linked to the bag itself. So we right click on that, I'll go scripting editor, and you'll see here we have the bag. So global, this is where all the code was to set up the game. This code is actually on the bag itself. So what we have here, very simple little function. Function on object enter container. So this is basically saying when an object enters any container. We're specifically looking at bags, and it's when any object enters. What we're doing here then is going if bag, which is the bag up here, equals self, which is itself, then we want to go self.shuffle, and that will just shuffle everything that's in there. So whenever a new object enters that bag, it will shuffle itself, basically. So I'll close that. So normally, for a regular bag, this one is almost a regular bag, so if I was to drop a green, then a blue, then a yellow cube in here, and then take them out, they will come out in that same order that they went in. Or if I place them in here, green, blue, yellow, and then I take one out, I've got the green one, then the yellow one, and the blue one, because it shuffled it each time a piece has entered that bag. So this other bag over here, this one is a hidden bag. So you'll see when I hover over this bag, it shows you how many things are in it as you place objects in there. Depending on the game that you have, you may not want that to be visible to other players. So what I've done on this bag, I've called it a hidden count bag. I'll go into the scripting editor again. Basically all we're doing is turning off the tooltip, which shows how many things are in the bag. So same again, function on load, so that is when this bag loads, because it's on the bag itself. We go self, which is referring to the bag, dot tooltip, which is that little pop-up, equals false. And what that does is it just turns off that tooltip so that it doesn't show. So if I drop that in there, you'll see it doesn't show how many things are in that bag. I can drop another one in, drop another one in. I can go right click, search, and you can see that the cubes are in fact in there, but it just doesn't show users what's inside there. So that's some other cool little things that you can sort of do and play around with. So it's quite powerful, the scripting within Tabletop Simulator, and you can do a lot with it. And hopefully that gives you a nice little overview of how you can set up games and how you can start playing around with it. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below, and I'll do my best to answer them. And yeah, happy gaming!